Have you ever reached a place where every direction looked closed? Ahead of you was water. Behind you was the power you had escaped. There was no bridge, no hidden road, and no strength left to fight your way through. That is where the story of the Red Sea begins. It begins not with a miracle, but with people who are afraid. Israel had left Egypt. They had left the land where they had carried burdens that were not theirs to choose, where their days had been shaped by another ruler's command. Yet, leaving a place of slavery did not mean that slavery had already left their hearts. When Pharaoh's army came after them, fear spoke quickly. The past seemed powerful again. Egypt was behind them, the sea was before them, and there was no way out. But Exodus tells this story so that we will see more than an escape. It tells of a God who brings people out of bondage, leads them when they cannot see the whole road, stands between them and what pursues them, and calls them to walk forward by faith. This is the story of the Exodus and the Red Sea. Before the sea, there was another night in Egypt. The people were told to prepare a lamb for each household, to eat in haste, with their sandals on their feet and their staffs in their hands. They were not settling in for an ordinary meal. They were preparing to leave. The blood of the lamb was placed on the two side posts and the upper doorpost of the houses where they ate. In the words of Exodus, that blood was a sign. God said, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." This was not a charm or a piece of spectacle. It marked a household that trusted God's word in the night before freedom. The judgment on Egypt belongs to the gravity of this story, but we do not need to turn it into a scene of horror. We will not imagine an angel as a visible character moving from door to door, and we will not use suffering as visual entertainment. The point is that the night exposed Egypt's power as unable to save, while God prepared his people to go. By morning, the families who had eaten in haste would leave with the memory of a marked doorway behind them. The Exodus did not begin at the shore of the sea. It began in homes, where people heard God's command, prepared to depart, and stepped into an uncertain future under his protection. In Exodus, Egypt is not merely a symbol. It is a real land, a real place of forced labor, fear, and bondage. Before the sea ever opens, God says to Israel, "I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rid you out of their bondage, and I will redeem you with a stretched out arm." The first truth of the Exodus is simple. God does not ask his people to become more comfortable inside slavery. He brings them out. That is more than a change of scenery. A slave may be moved from one field to another and still remain a slave. The Exodus is different because God claims a people for himself. He says that he will bring them out, rid them of bondage, redeem them with an outstretched arm, and take them to be his people. Freedom is not simply the absence of Pharaoh. It is the beginning of belonging to the Lord. That is why the wilderness matters. Israel is not released into a life with no master at all. They are brought from a master who destroys to the God who gives life. The difference is not merely between oppression and independence. It is between a power that uses people and the God who saves them, leads them, and teaches them how to live. For Christian readers, this keeps the spiritual meaning from becoming vague. Freedom from sin is not simply the freedom to do whatever we desire. It is freedom to belong to Christ, to walk in the Spirit, and to become the people God calls us to be. The old life says, you are owned by your fear, your appetite, your shame, or your past. The Exodus says that the God who redeems also gives a new name and a new future. For Christian readers, this story has also become a living image of another bondage. The New Testament speaks about no longer serving sin and about not being entangled again with a yoke of bondage. That does not erase Egypt from the story. Egypt remains the real place of Israel's oppression, but the story helps us recognize the old life whenever fear, sin, shame, or destructive habits begin to act like masters again. Some chains are visible. Others are woven into our habits, our loyalties, and the things we return to because they are familiar. A person can be free from one place and still long for it when fear rises. That is why the Exodus is not only about leaving Egypt, it is about learning who truly leads you after Egypt is behind you. Exodus says that when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the shortest road. There was a nearer way, but it would have placed them quickly in the path of war. The text says that the people might see war, become afraid, and return to Egypt. So the road was longer. It went toward the wilderness. This is one of the first surprises in the story. Being led by God did not mean that. Israel immediately received the fastest route, the easiest route, or the route they could explain. They were led away from the familiar road and toward a place where their future would become unclear. Yet they were not left alone. By day, the Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud to lead the way. By night, He went before them in a pillar of fire to give them light. The cloud did not remove the wilderness. The fire did not remove every danger, but both testified to one thing: the people were not traveling by themselves. Egyptian chariots were real instruments of power in the ancient world. They were fast, mobile, and terrifying to people on foot. But Exodus does not need us to know the name of Pharaoh, the exact date of the event, or the exact size of every unit in the army. The point is clear enough. The power that had enslaved Israel was coming after them. When Israel looked up, they saw the Egyptians marching behind them. They were terrified. They cried out, and then they accused Moses. Their words are harsh, because there were no graves in Egypt. Hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? They remembered Egypt as the place of bondage, yet in fear. They began to speak of it as if it had been safer than freedom. Fear can do that. It can make the old master look merciful. It can make a familiar prison seem more secure than an unfamiliar promise. It can whisper that freedom is too dangerous, that obedience is too costly, and that returning is wiser than moving forward. But Moses answered the people, "Fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord." Those words are not a denial of danger. The sea was still there. The army was still there. Faith is not pretending that the threat has disappeared. Faith is refusing to let the threat have the final word. And then, almost immediately, the story gives a second command. The Lord tells Moses, "Speak unto the children of Israel, that they go forward, stand still, and go forward." At first, those commands can sound opposite, but together they reveal the heart of faith. To stand still is to refuse panic. It is to stop letting fear rule the imagination. It is to see that salvation comes from the Lord. To go forward is to obey. When the next step becomes clear, even if the whole journey is not. Israel would not create a path by its own power. It would not defeat Pharaoh by its own strength. But neither would it remain forever frozen on the shore. The people were called to trust the God who saves, and then to walk where He led. Before the sea opened, something else happened. The pillar of cloud, which had gone before Israel, moved behind them. It came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. To one side it was darkness, to the other it gave light. Through the night, the two sides did not come near each other. This scene is easy to pass over, but it matters. Deliverance did not begin only when Israel reached the far shore. Protection had already begun in the night. They were still afraid. They were still beside the sea. But what pursued them could not simply take them. Sometimes God's rescue does not look like an instant arrival. Sometimes it begins as a boundary in the dark, enough light to keep walking, enough protection to keep the enemy from closing in, enough time to take the next faithful step. Notice the tenderness in that moment. Israel had not yet seen the waters divided. They had not yet reached dry ground. They had not yet sung on the far shore. All they had was darkness on one side, light on the other, and the presence of God between them and the army. There are seasons when that is what faith looks like. Not the full answer, not the final, sure, not a life without danger, only enough light for the next step, and the assurance that what pursues us does not have unlimited access to us. The pillar had led them in front. Now it stood behind them. The God who leads also guards. He does not only point toward a destination. He places himself between his people and the power that would drag them back. This does not mean that every night becomes easy. Israel still had to wait through the darkness, but their waiting was no longer empty. The night itself became part of the rescue. Before God opened the sea, He made room for His people to breathe, to listen, and to move when He called. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. Exodus says that the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind through the night. The waters were divided, dry land appeared, and the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, with waters like a wall on their right hand and on their left. For centuries, people have debated the precise location of this crossing. They have debated the name of the sea, possible routes, and possible natural processes. Those questions can be studied, but Exodus itself does not give us a modern coordinate on a map. It gives us a story. The story says that where there had been no road, God made a way. Israel did not escape by finding a secret path. They did not build a fleet. They did not overpower Egypt. They walked through the very barrier that had seemed to end their journey. And they had to walk. The waters did not carry them across while they remained on the shore. Step by step, they entered the way God had opened. Perhaps fear did not disappear in the first step. Perhaps the sound of the army was still behind them. But faith was no longer only a word, spoken on the shore. It became movement. This is not a promise that every danger in our lives will be removed in the same way. It is not permission to force every hardship into a simple formula, but it does show us something about the character of faith. Faith does not mean that we control the sea. Faith means that we trust the God who leads us out of bondage, even when the road He opens is unlike any road we could have made for ourselves. The Egyptians pursued them into the sea. The chariots followed the path of dry ground. But Exodus says that during the night watch, the Egyptian army was thrown into confusion. Their chariot wheels became difficult to drive. The force that had chased Israel into terror could not control the path God had made for Israel. Then, at daybreak, the waters returned. The army that had seemed unstoppable was overcome. Exodus does not invite us to watch this as a spectacle of destruction. It tells us that on that day, the Lord saved Israel out of the hand of the Egyptians. That phrase matters. The story is not only about an enemy losing, it is about a people no longer being held. The hand that had demanded their labor, shaped their days, and pursued them into the wilderness could not claim them forever. Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore, and the people saw the great work which the Lord did against Egypt. They feared the Lord and believed the Lord and His servant Moses. There is a difference between escaping a place and understanding that its power is broken. Israel needed both. They needed to leave Egypt, and they needed to see that Egypt could no longer decide their future. For Christian faith, this is where the spiritual image becomes especially searching. The old life often tries to speak after we have left it. Sin may promise comfort. Fear may promise safety. Old patterns may call us back because they are familiar, but freedom is not merely being removed from one location. Freedom is learning that the old master does not own the future. The New Testament speaks of an old self, crucified with Christ, so that we should no longer be servants of sin. It calls believers to stand fast in the freedom Christ gives, and not to be entangled again with a yoke of bondage. That freedom is not self-made courage. It begins with God's grace, and like Israel's journey, it becomes visible as people learn to walk forward under His leading. But the Red Sea story does not end with the returning waters. Exodus 15 begins with a song. Moses and the children of Israel sing to the Lord. I will sing unto the Lord, for He hath triumphed gloriously. The song does not simply celebrate survival. It names who God is. "The Lord is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation." That is the climax of the story. The sea opens. The pursuer is stopped. But the deepest response is not applause for a dramatic escape. It is worship. The people learn to speak of God as their strength, their song, and their salvation. Then Miriam, the prophetess, takes a timbrel in her hand. The women go after her with timbrels and with dances. Miriam answers them, "Sing ye to the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously." This is not the memory of one leader alone. It becomes the memory of a people. They sing because they need to remember. Fear leaves memories behind. Egypt had taught them fear. Slavery had trained them to expect commands from another master. The wilderness would soon bring new hunger, thirst, and uncertainty. So they needed a song stronger than their fear. They needed to remember that the God who brought them out had not abandoned them at the shore. They needed to remember that he made a way where they saw none. They needed to remember that the power behind them was not the final power over them. The next part of Exodus does not pretend that all struggle has ended. Soon the people enter the wilderness and find bitter water. They will face new tests. They will complain again. The Red Sea is not the end of their story, but it changes how their story can be told. What follows is not a promise of an easy life, but a new center for their identity. The Lord who redeemed them is the one who will lead them onward. They are no longer only people who came out of Egypt. They are people who saw deliverance. They are people who learned to sing. They are people called to live not under Pharaoh's command, but under the leading of the Lord. This is also why the song matters after the sea. Freedom must be remembered, or fear will rewrite the past. When hardship returned in the wilderness, Israel could be tempted to say that Egypt had been better. The song answered that temptation. It placed the story of God's deliverance in the mouth of the people. We need that kind of memory as well. The old life often returns first as a voice. It says that bondage was normal, that compromise was harmless, that fear was realistic, and that freedom is too demanding. But praise remembers differently. It remembers what God has done. It remembers that the path was opened by grace, not by our own strength. To refuse the old bondage is not to pretend that temptation has vanished. It is to refuse to call a former master home. It is to keep walking in the freedom God has given, with humility, dependence, and faith. Israel's journey was not finished at the Red Sea. Neither is ours. But the sea became a marker. The old master had no final claim. Perhaps that is why this ancient story still speaks with such force. We all know something about the pull of what is behind us. We know the fear of a future that appears closed. We know the temptation to return to what enslaved us because it is familiar. The Exodus does not tell us to deny the sea. It does not ask us to call danger harmless. It tells us to look beyond the sea and beyond the pursuer, to the God who brings people out of bondage. At the shore, Israel was told to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Then it was told to go forward. That is not a contradiction. It is the rhythm of faith. We do not save ourselves. We do not command the waters. We do not break every chain by our own strength. God acts first. God leads first. God makes the way. And then He calls us to trust Him enough to take the next step. The sea was before them. Egypt was behind them. What looked like the end became the place where they first learned to walk free. Thank you for watching this Timeless Worlds episode. What do you think the Red Sea story reveals about freedom, fear, and faith? Share your thoughts below. If stories from Scripture, history, and the ancient world are helpful to you, subscribe to Timeless Worlds for more. Please like the video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who would enjoy a deeper look at the ancient world.